Well, hello everyone. I am so excited because today we have joining us Sadhvi, Bhagawati, Saraswatji. And Sadhvi is one of the preeminent female spiritualists in the world. And her journey is all about healing and about how she has brought herself to the world itself and to the people in the world and some of the most marginalized communities that Sadhvi helps in India and beyond. So we're so thankful, Sadhvi, that you're with us today. And I think it's especially exciting to have you join us because this is on really the early stages of the launch of your new book, which is very exciting, Hollywood to the Himalayas. And I hope you'll share a little bit of that journey and the book with us. But Sadhvi, it's just an honor to have you. Sadhvi is recognized by the United Nations, by the government of India and the United States, works closely with groups like UNICEF. And we're just thrilled to be able to hear more from you today, which we look forward to sharing with our corporate and international nonprofit audiences and donors around the world that give to global causes with global impact. And hopefully help them and encourage them how to use their story to make a global impact. So Sadhvi, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so blessed and honored and grateful and excited to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. And to start off, I think it would be wonderful if you would be willing to share a little bit about your life story and your journey and kind of what have been some of those sentinel moments that have shaped that journey and given you kind of a sense of where your path would take you.
Beautiful. So I just turned 50 a few months ago. So there have been a lot of moments in 50 years. Going back to those really formative moments in early childhood as our whole self-identity and personality and way of understanding ourselves in the world get created and formed. For me, I had a really interesting juxtaposition. On the one hand, I was born and raised in great opportunity, great privilege. I grew up in California. I had parents who just adored me, gave me everything. I had a fantastic education, both primary education, and also I graduated from Stanford University. Undergraduate, I was then in the midst of a PhD program in psychology. I had all of that, which from the outside looking in, we would need in order to be happy, in order to be peaceful, in order to have our lives be the way that so many of us envision our lives should be, that foundation of a successful, happy life. And on the other hand, I also was really struggling. I had experienced great trauma in early childhood and was impacted by that on a very, very deep level. And it was a history of abuse and abandonment, and that stayed with me, obviously, on a very, very deep level. And it led me in adolescence and in early 20s to do what so many of us do when we have any kind of pain. It doesn't have to necessarily be, something that we would label as a massive trauma. It may just be stress of daily life. It may be unfulfilled expectations. It may be too much uncertainty. It may be feelings of negativity toward oneself. But all of these lead us into this attempt to free ourselves of that very uncomfortable internal situation. So the pain, the anger, the grudges, the stress, the sadness, the feeling of not being enough, all of that creates that soil in which so many patterns of behavior and patterns of living emerge. And those patterns are very frequently really well intentioned, but just neither effective nor skillful. And so a lot of us end up turning to substances, drugs, alcohol, food, gambling, sex, Facebook, whatever we may be getting addicted to, whether a hard, severe addiction or a kind of soft, minor addiction. Either way, we tend to go in the direction of things that will, we believe, alleviate the distress of the present moment. And the dilemma with that is that while it's very well intentioned, we really have our own best interests at heart to alleviate that stress and distress, obviously it never works. And it actually ends up making the situation internally and externally much worse. And so I was in a situation by the time I was 25 when, from the outside, I was living this great success. I had graduated from Stanford. I was in the midst of a PhD program. I was doing really, really well on so many levels. And yet, I was still struggling on the inside. I was learning to manage that struggle. But the dilemma with that is that managing something is not really the highest goal. But it is what those of us who struggle and get help for the struggle tend to be told is the best we can hope for. So whether it's in therapy or any kind of counseling or any kind of treatment or any kind of help, whether through a book or an individual or a course, whatever it may be, they're aimed to help us manage our pain, manage our anger, manage our grudges, manage our history, manage our negative emotions, manage our negative thoughts, manage our addictions. And it's a wonderful first step. It's certainly better than not managing them. But it isn't a very high ideal. And what it does is it paints a picture that we really are going to spend the rest of our lives struggling to manage it. So at 25, that's where I was. And I ended up on a flight to India with a backpack because I was married to a man who was on a spiritual quest. I was not, simply because I didn't know that a spiritual quest was something available for someone like me. I believed on a very core subconscious level that I somehow was unworthy of grace, unworthy of the presence of the divine in my life, that because of what had been done to me and because of the way that I had responded to that throughout my life, that I somehow was not good enough, not worthy enough, not pure enough for grace, for a spiritual path. And that was okay. It wasn't something that I ever thought much about. It didn't bother me. I was a hardcore academic. I was an activist. I worked for Greenpeace. I organized, the first Earth Day event at Stanford that had ever happened. I was an avid vegetarian, or vegetarist, as my friends used to call me, because I was so ardent in my urging of others to also adopt this way of living for our planet, for the animals, for human beings who were suffering. So I had my academics, I had my activism, I had my social life, I had everything. I didn't know that spirituality was something I should be yearning for. But my husband was on a spiritual quest and he was looking for a guru. And so we traveled to India. I agreed to go actually only because, as a strict vegetarian, I had had great difficulty in Europe, in South America, even in parts of the US, explaining to waiters, especially in languages I didn't speak if I was abroad, that vegetable soup flavored with chicken broth was not vegetarian, or a salad that had fish on it was not vegetarian. So I agreed to go to India because I knew that Indians understood what vegetarian means and that I could eat happily and calmly and healthily anywhere in the country. So there we were on a plane to India. And it's a long story. I won't go into it all here. But just to mention that when I got there, and when I got especially to Rishikesh, which is the place I now live, it was the first place we went to. It's a holy city in the lap of the Himalayas, right on the banks of the sacred Ganga River, what we call the Ganges, but in Sanskrit, the word is Ganga. And I was given an experience there of such powerful spiritual transformation, of such an experience of feeling oneness with God, oneness with the universe, oneness with myself, feeling a rightness about myself in that connection to God, to the divine, to the universe. There was just this extraordinary awareness of the perfection, the interconnectedness, and the infiniteness of myself, of the universe, of my relationship to the universe. And I knew that that was where I needed to stay. And there were a series, you asked about the events, there were a series of events that took place over the next couple of weeks that really made me know I was meant to stay there. And I give all of the stories are there in my memoir that you mentioned. But just to touch upon them, I literally had my feet glued to the ground of the ashram. I literally could not walk out. I couldn't pick my feet up off the ground. I literally heard a voice. I, who had never heard voices, didn't know anyone short of Joan of Arc and schizophrenics who heard voices. I heard a voice telling me I needed to stay there. And there were a series of these things that happened that made me know this is where I am meant to be. And so I've been there the last 25 years. And what I have learned there on such a deep level is that if we want to be of benefit to the world, because as I mentioned, I was already an activist. I was an anti-war activist. I was a staunch environmental activist. I was an activist for children. I was already doing a lot of volunteer work with babies who were born drug addicted because their mothers were using while they were pregnant. I was already doing advocacy work for children who had been sexually abused. So I deeply, deeply wanted to serve, to help. But until and unless in our own lives, we are able to address the dis-ease, the distress that afflicts us, we're not going to be nearly as powerful or impactful agents of change in the world, because we move through the world mired in our own false identities, in our own suffering, in our own self-judgment, in our own self-doubt, in nonsense competition and jealousy between other people. This constant sense of I'm not doing enough. And we're unable then to actually hear the inner voice. We are unable to feel the flow of the divine universe through us. And ultimately, the best instruments, the best tools, the best vehicles and vessels we can be of service, of change, of impact, are when we align ourselves with the flow of the universe. When we, for example, metaphorically, become instruments that help apple seeds sprout and grow into apple trees that give branches full of apples to feed people. But if in our confusion, if in our distress, we are attached to the idea that that apple seed must give oranges, neither will we be impactful or effective at all, nor will we actually live in any kind of peace or joy or meaning. And so what I have found is that my greatest impact comes when I can live in alignment. And for me, lastly, there's so much to say, but I'll end this question with a last metaphor, which is, for me, I use the moon as my way of thinking about this, because the full moon throughout history has been not only something that has been beloved and serenaded with poems and songs and sonnets about its beauty and its glory and its light, but it has also been, before the very, very, very modern age, it has been really the greatest asset for those living in the forest, living in the jungles, needing to find their way, for sailors on the ocean, for anyone who needed to see anything. The moon was the way. And yet, we know that the moon doesn't actually have any light of her own. We also know that the moon doesn't actually ever change shape. The moon itself never becomes half or a quarter or full or disappears entirely. What happens during the course of the month when we go from full to new moon and back again is that the moon goes into and out of alignment between the earth and the sun. So she becomes a better and not so effective reflector of the light of the sun onto the earth. And what I love about that metaphor is, number one, it takes that burden of responsibility off of me. It's not about what I individually am going to produce. It's what I'm going to be able to be a channel for. Like the moon is that channel of the light of the sun. Can we, as St. Francis of Assisi said so beautifully, be an instrument of mercy, an instrument of grace, an instrument of light, of healing, of hope, an instrument of that? As we align ourselves with that divine presence. And of course, it doesn't matter what your religious tradition may be. Doesn't even matter if you have one. But we align ourselves with that presence of benevolence, of light, of life, of love in the universe. That same presence that causes a flower to open its petals to the sun. That same presence that guides a tree to grow sideways to get the light instead of straight up, when where it lives is somewhere that straight up it wouldn't get any light. So somehow it just knows to grow sideways. That intelligence in the universe, that energy in the universe, when we align ourselves with that, then we, like the moon, become able to be these incredible instruments of light, of impact, of change. But it's not about what I am producing. It's about how much in alignment I am with that divine flow. And that's why we need to first find that healing and that ease rather than dis-ease within ourselves, because we can only share with the world what we have if we live in peace. We share peace. If, as my guru says, if we live in pieces instead of peace, well, that's what we share in the world. It's like if you think of an air conditioner, one of the old kinds, not the new kinds that'll give you either cold air or hot air, but one of the old kinds. It only gives you cold air. Now, that's great in July. It's not so good in January. But it's not the fault of the air conditioner if you turn it on, stand in front of it, and end up with pneumonia. That's all it's got. And in the same way, if we are filled with tension and stress and a sense of lack and anger and doubt and fear and illusion, well, we're not going to be able to bring the type of impact that our world needs. So we learn to heal ourselves, for our spiritual unfolding, but also just very practically, because that's the way we become more powerful instruments of mercy, of grace, of healing, of light in the world.
Well, Sadhvi, that is remarkable. And to think about your journey, which had, in many ways, the trappings of success, and yet had very difficult times and burdens that you had to carry, and you chose the love. You chose to allow yourself to be emptied, to be able to forgive yourself, to have grace, but also to be in alignment with the universe and give really this opportunity to be an instrument for seeds of hope, which is remarkable. When you think about that, how did that journey and that decision to really be an instrument, how has that impacted your work today?
Beautiful. So from childhood, I always knew that I was meant to serve and I was meant to help. I don't even remember how that awareness first came to me, but I do remember I grew up in LA, as I mentioned, but my mother's family was from New York. And so we used to go back to New York every year for Thanksgiving. And because I grew up in a very residential part of LA, Whereas most of LA is, you don't get to walk out of your house and walk down the block and have a store. LA is very, very spread out, very divided. But New York was really, really interesting because we would walk out of my grandparents' house, and right there on the street is everything, is the whole city. And I used to love to buy pretzels and chestnuts and hot chocolate on the side of the road. And so my dad would give me $20, and I was allowed to spend it however I wanted. And I could buy pretzels and chestnuts and hot chocolate. And inevitably, year after year, the same thing would happen. He would give me the money when we got out of their house. And by the time we got to the very first pretzel place or ice cream place or whatever I wanted that day, I would turn to my dad and say, I need money. And he'd be like, what happened to your money? And because he never gave it to me as a $20 bill, he would always give it to me in, lots of loose bills so that I could spend them in different ways. And by the time we had gotten to the first vendor I wanted to buy something from, I had given the entire $20 out in various denominations to everyone we had passed along the way, all of the homeless people, all of the beggars, which I wasn't used to seeing in LA. And I was so impacted by that the idea of having money in my hand and not giving it to someone was just, it was inconceivable to me. And I remember when I got a little bit older, I just started driving. So maybe I was 16, maybe 17, but probably 16. And I pulled into the ATM one day. And the ATM was in a big parking lot with a grocery store and a drugstore. And as I walked up to the ATM, a woman approached me with her daughter, and she was homeless and she needed some money. And I proceeded to empty my entire bank account into this woman's hands. I didn't have much. I had less than whatever the daily maximum you could withdraw was. So I literally withdrew every single penny in my bank account and handed it to this woman. That was how I was from childhood. When I got to India, though, something very profound happened. I remember I had been there maybe a few months. And I was taken one day by my guru to go see these schools. He said, do you want to go on a little field trip? And I said, yes, of course. And he said, because there's this organization that runs free schools in the slums, and they don't have the money to run anymore. And so they've approached us. He is, by the way, my guru is just the embodiment of service as spiritual practice. That's really his motto in the world, is the highest manifestation of meditation is in service. So people had approached him and said, we have these 10 schools that we've been running, and kids come every day, teachers come, but we don't have any more money to run it. And the roof over here is leaking, and there's no floor over here, and we don't have money for books over here, and whatever it was in different schools, all part of the same massive slum area outside of Delhi. So we went, and I spent the day going from school to school that took place in just quintessential Indian slums. People living in tents made out of tarpaulin and scraps of cloth, goats roaming everywhere, people sort of sleeping on straw mats outside, cooking rice over gasoline fires. And in the midst of this, there were these schools. And God, it makes me cry to this day just to think about it. And so at the end of the day, when we get back to where we were staying in Delhi, it was dinner time, and I was crying and I couldn't eat, and I said, no, no, no. And my guru looked at me and he said, are your tears helping them? And I said, God, of course not. And he's got a very interesting way of teaching, which when you don't know him can sound very harsh. And all I can say is he's actually the most gentle and compassionate being on the planet. It's just, he speaks truth. And the truth sometimes feels harsh, but in the presence of it being spoken with such compassion, you take it in as love and as compassion. So he looks at me and he says, your tears aren't helping them. He said, your tears are only helping yourself, because sitting here, you feel really good about yourself. You feel like, oh my God, I am such a compassionate human being. Look, I can't even eat my dinner because I'm so upset about these children in the slums. He said, this is not about helping your ego. This is about helping them. And they are not going to be helped by your inability to eat your dinner. He said, if you really want to help them, have dinner, go to sleep early, and get up at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning and figure out how you're going to raise enough money to actually support all of these 10 schools that we need to adopt. And it became this just incredible infusion of power, that it wasn't about drama. It wasn't about woe is me. It wasn't about my identification as a child victim of some misfortune, but rather it was about me as an effective, impactful tool, free of my drama, free of my own ego stories, but actually able to be that agent of change. So I did exactly what he said. I couldn't eat much, but I did go to sleep early, and I got up early the next morning, and thus was founded our foundation for children and women that runs schools and orphanages and women's vocational training programs. So the lessons that I've learned at different stages really enabled me to serve in that way. And lastly, what I would say about this is that when we serve, it's very easy to get wrapped up again in that drama. And so whether it's the drama of the, oh my God, there's this horrible situation, let us have a big drama about it rather than actually work to fix it. There's also the drama of us as doers, us as givers, us as the ones who have, those people as other, as the receivers, as those who don't. And the spiritual teaching of giving and serving is actually that it is a spiritual practice. It's not about we who have serving those who don't. It's about those who don't giving us the gift of enabling us to serve them, allowing us to serve them, so that we, in serving, might have the opportunity to awaken spiritually into the awareness that there is no separation between us and them. That we are serving our own self. As we are a reflection of the divine, so are they a reflection of the divine. As we are soul, spirit, consciousness, so are they soul, spirit, consciousness, just in different physical forms. And they are giving us the opportunity to have an expanded sense of self, Because at the moment, my sense of self is just me right over here. This is where I end. I am, a certain height from toe to head. I'm a certain weight. I occupy a certain amount of space. This is me. But that's a very limited view of self. The expansive view of self is that it's all us. Every starving child, every woman dying in childbirth, every tree being felled, every river being polluted, every child dying of diarrhea from drinking the water of the river that was polluted. They're all us. And through the act of service, we are able to have that experience. And it's interesting because although I have learned this in the Indian context, in the Eastern tradition context, I think about the teaching that Jesus Christ gave of love thy neighbor as thyself. And when you think about it, and I've asked a lot of Christian theologians about this as I now have the opportunity to be moving in high-level interfaith worlds, I've said, did Jesus ever give any idea about like what kind of radius he was talking about neighbors, like next door neighbor, on your block neighbor, 50-yard radius, 500-yard radius? Did he ever give any indication of what type of area we were talking about that counted as a neighbor? And everyone says no. And then, of course, the question is, well, how many of you even know the names of everyone just on your street? Almost none of us. And if we don't even know their names, how can we possibly love them? And then, of course, when we realize that we never were told how far out neighbor means. So maybe it's 1 kilometer, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 10,000. And if we don't even know everyone, the idea that we've been given an instruction to love them doesn't seem to make much sense, and it certainly doesn't seem like it can be fulfilled. And yet here it is. It's canon. It's scripture. It's the word of the divine. And so what to me it means is that what he's saying is love God and recognize that everyone is a reflection of, manifestation of, child of, however we think of it, of God, the same way that you are. And therefore, when you see anyone, rather than seeing them as other, even if they are your 10,000 kilometer away neighbor, instead of seeing them as other, you see them as self, because you can't love them as self until you recognize them as self. And the only way to recognize them as self is to recognize that we are one with the divine, the child of the divine, the reflection of the divine, as is everyone, which means we are one. So in service, we have the opportunity to actually learn that in a very experiential way, that we are serving ourself in others, our capital S self, that divine self, that presence of God in us. We are serving it in others.
Yeah, in fact, I think of the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, service is one of the greatest endeavors, service to others, one of the greatest endeavors anyone can undertake.
Absolutely.
And you certainly have done that with your schools and with your work, both in the schools and women and children, but also in climate change. As you look ahead, what advice do you have to the next generation about how they utilize themselves as an instrument and how they make their own global impact?
Mm. Fantastic. So for this, we need to have 3 C's. Number 1, connection. Number 2, courage. Number 3, creativity. First, you need to be connected because the world is changing really fast. If you are mid to late 20s, even, that which you learned back in school is probably obsolete by now. I know what I learned in school is mostly obsolete. But even if you're mid to late 20s, a lot of that which you learned is probably obsolete by now, certainly with regard to what we know about science, what we know about the nature of the human body, the human brain, what we know about the earth, our climate, our environment, our ability through technology to work with the body, with the brain, with the climate, with the environment, with our sisters and brothers around the world. And so, whereas there may have been a time in history when simply memorizing facts, learning facts was enough, or learning processes was enough, we're not there anymore. By the time you learn it, there's already a new process, right? It's like all of us, we learn how to finally work this model of phone and now it's obsolete. Or I learned how to finally make a certain app work and now there's, nobody uses it anymore and you have to learn a brand new one. So what you need is connection. Connection to that source in the universe, that source of wisdom, of intelligence that makes an apple seed turn into an apple tree that gives us apples, that makes a caterpillar know how to become a butterfly, that makes everything in nature know, that makes that tree know how to grow sideways such that it gets light. That intelligence in the universe, you need to connect to it, because that connection is what's going to enable you to intuit what needs to be done and then to do it. It's no longer about rote memorization. It's no longer about simply doing what other generations have done. Because what other generations have done has gotten us into the mess we are today. We need an entirely new way of thinking about ourselves, about our planet, about our interconnection with the planet. Thinking about human responsibility just as much as we think about human rights. So as we shift and as we change, you need to be connected to that flow of wisdom, of intelligence, of creation in the universe, because it will guide you. It will enable you to intuit the problem and the solution. And for that, you need to develop a sense of connection within yourself, with yourself. There's a great joke of a man who goes to the doctor and he says to the doctor, "Doctor, something is very wrong with me. Whatever I touch, it hurts. When I touch my head, it hurts. And I touch my stomach, it hurts. And I touch my knees, they hurt." So the doctor runs every test and every scan. And he calls the man back in and he says, "Well, the good news is there's nothing wrong with your head or your stomach or your knees. The bad news is your finger is broken. And since your finger is broken, naturally, whatever you touch, it hurts. But it hurts not because the problem is outside, but because the problem is in the broken connection, in the bone. And I love this joke, this story, because a lot of us move through the world in a way where our lives hurt. But we blame things outside, our relationships, our jobs, traffic, the weather, the pandemic, interest rates, whatever it may be, stock market, our family members, our employers, our employees. But really, the problem is that broken internal connection. And this is where a practice of meditation, a practice of connecting to yourself, to your breath. Again, it doesn't matter what your religious or spiritual tradition may be, or even if there is no religious or spiritual tradition. Just connect with your breath. Connect with your higher self, with your true self. Anchor yourself in that, because that will guide you in the same way that a tree gets its nourishment from the soil, from the air, from the sun. In the same way, when we are connected to that source, that's where we get it. Otherwise, I've got this great microphone here, this great light there, this great camera there, and they all work wonderfully because they're all plugged in. But if you unplugged any of them, it doesn't matter how expensive or great or brand new or covered with gold or diamonds they may be. They're not, obviously, but even if I did, even if we covered a lamp with gold and diamonds, if the cord of that lamp was not plugged into the wall, it wouldn't be able to give you any light, regardless of how fancy it may look. So that connection with the source within is essential. And from that connection comes courage, open-hearted courage to then live by that which we have come to know. The courage that sends a caterpillar up the tree to weave a cocoon. The courage that a seed uses to sprout out of the ground. The courage that all of creation uses to manifest itself. As you're connected, you will find that courage. And it's going to be courage to walk your path, to fulfill your purpose, your dharma, with your impact, and to know that the universe is sending impact through you, is sending service through you, is using you as an instrument of mercy, of grace, of healing, of light for others. And then lastly, creativity. Because as I began, the world keeps changing. So that which we thought worked 20 years ago is no longer that which we know works today. The world changes, our technology changes, our information changes, our abilities change. And as all of that changes, we have to be courageous to be creative in our approaches, in our way of solving, in our way of serving. And that's what you all have that is so extraordinary. Yes, earlier generations have done it in certain ways. And yes, you are going to come in and be able to say, hey, wait, why not like this? Hey, wait, why not that? And this is where that connection and that courage and that creativity is what you need today more than anything. We've got so many stories, you probably know them even better than I do, of the top, most impactful organizations, companies, with ripple impact into every corner of the world, being started in somebody's garage or the back of their car or their bedroom. These are those times where it's not about how much have you memorized that someone else taught, but it's about how can you use yourself, your time, your talent, your technology, your tenacity to really be that beautiful instrument here on earth. And what you'll find is not only will you have a huge impact, but you will find that at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, your internal sense, your internal experience is one of great joy and peace and bliss, because you're coming at it from a place of connection. So it's not, I have to do this so that I feel good about myself, or I have to do this so that I look better than that guy. It's, I have to do this because I am the riverbed through which the river is flowing. I am the flower giving the nectar to the bee. That just is your purpose. And that's why you do it. And that's where the real power and the real impact comes.
Sadhvi, from Hollywood to the Himalayas, the 3 C's of hope: connection, courage, creativity. Thank you for all you've done to bring us joy and to make a global impact. Thank you for joining us today.
It's been such a joy. Thank you. Thank you so much for this beautiful opportunity. And thank all of you listening for the impact that you are bringing to the world. The most beautiful mantra is to ask ourselves not what for me, but what through me. And this is the mantra of all of your lives. What through me? And you are so blessed to be able to be those instruments through which service is flowing.